What's crappin'? Stop yapping and build some shit. I'm Cordell Rufus the third, and we just finished getting together the 2JZ 5 bajillion horsepower bottom end build. There's going to be a time lapse after this little intro. We're in a different garage. I got a new place, so we're in a different garage, and then we're actually having a big building built, so we'll finish the build inside that nice big huge garage building. But let me get this thing out from bam. So this is what we got so far. So we have the CP badass pistons. They're super crazy turbo pistons that are good to, I think, 300 horsepower per cylinder. We have also the tri-beam, Manley rods, ACL bearings, all that good stuff. The block was machined and honed by Greg at Total Performance in Santee. They did a really good job. We have the real street billet mains, and then everything else you see here is pretty much brand new. I mean, the OEM water pump, everything is all pretty much brand new. Same thing with the Titan ported oil pump. We've gone through pretty much everything that we've done on this build so far on the other previous videos, but just wanted to give you guys a quick intro. And so we're going to start the time lapse. We kind of go over how you should file your rings and the best ways to do that for the high performance engines, especially if you're going to be running that much boost. So pretty cool. Check it out.
So right here I'm just kind of going over showing Mr. Marcos Leaning how to gap the rings just on cylinder number 1. So he has a good idea of the process. Mark is actually, he deals with tight tolerances all day long. He's a certified TIG welder and works in the aerospace industry as well. So he should be pretty good at it. So I just wanted to get him through the process of doing it. And then I actually had him gap all of the secondary rings on all 6 cylinders. And then just to kind of give him some practice, because the secondary rings aren't as critical. And then he went through and gapped all of the compression rings on all of the cylinders. He's used to playing with little Honda motors, so he's not used to having 6 holes in the block that have like the fire on top of the little round soda can looking things that move up and down when that little shaft spins and stuff. So he wasn't really used to that, so it was awkward for him, probably. You know, maybe as awkward as, you know, possibly his first sexual experience. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm just assuming. But I mean, we'll find out as we go along. I mean, more secrets will be revealed as the build goes on. So, but yeah, so we ended up getting all the rings gapped, and I'm just kind of working on the underside of the block. We had to put all the piston oilers back in there. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the GTE block has piston oilers. The GE block does not. So if you're going to build a GE block to save yourself some money, you might as well not do it. Because having those piston oilers, if you're planning on making a decent amount of power, makes a huge difference as far as longevity and keeping your rings having a good seal, the cylinder walls staying nice and cool. Same things with the pistons staying nice and cool. You're going to have a ton of heat going through those forged aluminum pistons. And those CPs actually have separate vent holes and oiling holes through the skirt, the bottom skirt. So when those piston oilers are spraying the bottom of the piston, it actually sprays out onto the cylinder walls underneath the oil rings. So everything that's engineered on a lot of the high horsepower pistons and stuff are specifically engineered to utilize those piston oilers. So you're probably going to want to go with the GTE block regardless. I don't know anything about the VVTi blocks, to be honest. I've never touched one. So I'm not sure if those have the piston oilers. I'm sure they probably do. Most of the, I mean, even Hondas, naturally aspirated Hondas have piston oilers. I know H22s and a lot of those other ones, H23s have them. So basically what we're doing is going down through here, gapping all the rings. I'm plugging up a lot of the holes, getting a lot of the hardware back on the block. What I'm doing is there's actually a tablet over there where I uploaded all of the photos from when I tore down the engine. So I'll use that tablet, go through, look at my photos to make sure I have everything oriented and I have all the studs and everything placed back on the block, because when this blocks goes through machining and hot tanking, they yank out all the plugs for the oil galleys as well as the freeze plugs and everything to flush the block to make sure there's no any metal chips or any foreign debris or FOD up in the block before you start doing final assembly. So you always want to make sure you go through and check all that stuff. All that stuff needs to be plugged back off. A lot of times your machinists won't tell you what stuff they pulled out. That's something you should know if you're building an engine. So make sure you go back through and double check everything. I'm really lucky that I get to work with Greg at Total Performance in Santee. So he actually went through and tapped all of the oil galley ports so I could go and plug them. And we used Permatech. It's called Permatech High Temp Thread Sealant, I think is what we used. And that's what he uses on all of his race engines. So that's what we used on this guy to make sure none of that stuff leaks and all the threaded plugs stay in there. So we're just going to continue to go through all these, set all the rings. The rings gapping and grinding takes forever. You're doing it by hand. We do have an electric ring filer that we use in our engine building room at where we build our race cars, but I don't like using it. Especially if you're learning how to do it, it's not a good idea to use power tools.
What's up, guys? Cordell Roof is the third here. Stop yapping and build some shit. We got Marcos leaning here. He's setting our piston ring gaps right now. If you follow the CP piston recommendations for their gaps, basically it goes off of whether you're turbocharging, whether you're naturally aspirated, a bunch of other parameters. But you can get, one of the main things you want to know about setting your piston rings is that if you go too tight and you're on a turbo application, when the cylinders actually shrink up in high heat or high boost environments, whatever, you're going to end up, if the rings actually end up touching each other, it's going to seize up. The ring will actually seize up in the cylinder, and the piston obviously is going to move because it has a ton of energy behind it, and it'll pop the top of the piston off and wreck the entire engine. So as a good rule of thumb, especially if you're going to be pushing the amount of power that we're pushing, it's safer to go a couple thousandths more than the recommendation. I believe the recommendation from CP, if you did like 750 horsepower plus turbo application on the 2JZ, ended up being about 24 thousandths. So we bumped the top ring gap to 28 thousandths, and then the secondary ring down up to about 32 thousandths. So we can, so we should be good, and we shouldn't have to worry about the rings touching and blowing out. Obviously, if you want to watch like a tutorial of setting ring gaps, I mean, you can watch the time lapse here, but we're basically just using a piston. We have an old 2JZ piston you're using to keep the ring square, put it about midway down in the sleeve, which should give you a more accurate measurement, and you're setting that ring for that cylinder for that piston. So you're going to go and set the rings for cylinder number 1. You're going to keep those rings with that cylinder, put them on piston number 1 and put them in that cylinder. So you want to set each ring gap for each specific bore. To calculate out their piston ring gaps, I think we're up at about 8 thou per inch. So it's an 86.5 millimeter bore because we're 20 thousandths over right now. So it ends up being a 3-inch 406 thousandths bore, 3.406. So you just multiply 0.008, 8 thousandths times 3.406, and you should end up somewhere around 0.28, which I think is what we used here. But basically if you follow CP's directions as well, they're going to want you to place the gaps in a certain spot. So if you look at the bottom of a 2JZ piston, a lot of times people don't understand which direction the pistons go. There's a machined notch. If you guys can see that, there's a machined notch right there. That's to clear the piston oilers that's in the bottom of the GTE engine. So make sure that is going on the oilers, I believe, on this motor, or on the exhaust side towards the back of the engine. So that's where these are. So this is the front of the engine. So I put arrows on all the pistons pointing forward. And then you're going to want your top compression ring gap right there. Your secondary compression ring gap right there, so they're 180 out from each other. And then the oil ring gaps are going to be both favoring the secondary ring gap side of the piston. And your oil rings, you don't need to set those gaps. Those gaps should be set. There is a minimum gap requirement, so if you want to double check one, you can. I believe the minimum is like 15th hour, 10th hour. But those rings are really thin. They're basically just in there to hold the oiling ring in. And make sure on these CPs that you go back here and check these extra oiling holes that they put in for burrs, because ours were full of burrs. So you're going to want to clean these pistons up. I would maybe even go so far as to hit the inside of these holes with some Scotch-Brite just to make sure all of the loose aluminum is out of them. But I'll show you how to install the rings on this piston with the exception of the... do you have the top ring done for cylinder number 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
One and two.
Okay. Then we'll throw on all of the rings. So it's always good to get a piston ring set of pliers, the expansion pliers. And you're going to want to adjust this screw so you're not opening them up so far that you bend the back radius on them. You just want to go out far enough to where you can get the back side of the ring into the slot, slide it in, and then you'll have more room in the front to slide that down and get them in there without bending the damn thing. So we'll go ahead and throw these rings on. You're going to want to start with the oiling ring. With the oiling rings, you need to put the actual, like, it looks like a potato chip. Put that actually in first, because there's a lip on the back of it that these rings sit against that holds this thing in. So if you put this on first, or you put the rings in first, you won't be able to get this in there because the back side of it that sits closest to the piston is actually thicker than the front edge. So you're going to want to put those in first. And you can put that gap anywhere you really want to. Obviously you don't want any of the gaps to line up, but so I generally just move that gap towards the top compression ring side of the piston, so that way it's out of the way and I don't have to worry about it ever lining up, because our oiling ring gaps are going to go clear on the other side. And then you can start to work these down. These oiling rings are generally super pliable, so you don't really have to worry about using the ring expansion on them. So they just pop right in. So the first one will go up on the top of that oiling ring, and then the second one we're going to want the gap over there. So we're going to run that one over here on this side, and we're going to pop it all the way down to the bottom of that oiling ring. So these oiling rings are capturing that ridge ring inside of them, and they'll hold that ridge ring in there. So that should be it. So you now have your one gap on there, the other gap towards that line. So now we can set the secondary ring gap right there. So we'll go ahead and set that one. When we do that one, we're going to use the pliers. A fun fact, the rings have a N or a dot or a marking on the top of them. That goes up towards the top of the piston, towards the top of the engine. Also on the CP pistons, the rings, the secondary ring is usually black and the top compression ring is usually silver, and they're not labeled, so just look at the colors. It scared me. So we're going to use the piston ring compression tools just to open it up, get that side slotted in there, and when it slides into the, as soon as it's slid in there, then you can drop it in, and that's it. So make sure your N or dot is up and you're lined up with that gap. Our oiling ring is right there, oiling ring gap's there, and then our top compression ring is going to go clear on the other side of the piston. So we can do that one too. Number 2's done?
Yeah.
Cool. I'll make sure when you ring file these, when you're cranking or even using the electric ring file, you want to rotate the ring file towards the inside of the cylinder, the inside of this opening. So you don't want to be rotating the file, whoops, this way, because you're going to push a burr up on the part.
if you rotate it towards the inside, you'll have less of a burr, and a lot of times you won't have a burr at all. Aside from that, make sure to use like a stone or a really fine file just to knock the burrs off. You don't want to bevel the edge, you just want to knock the burrs off. So we're going to use the same method on the top compression ring. Make sure your end is up. Expand this out. The top ring usually takes a little less expansion just because it's so close to the top. And that's it. So we got all the ends up. Secondary ring gap, top ring gap, oil ring gap, and that's it for that piston, and that's the front of the engine. So you have a larger relief for the intake side valves and a smaller relief for the exhaust side valves. So that's pretty much it. You repeat the process on all 6 pistons, and then we can go over installing them with a Wiseco piston sleeve. Pretty cool.
So we're going through finishing gapping the compression rings. I think we ended up with 28 thou on compression and 32 thou on secondary rings. Generally, you want 4 to 8 thous differential between your compression ring and your secondary. Now we're going to go through and get the crank ready to get installed. So you're going to want to put all your ARP studs in, and do not torque those. You need to hand tighten them all the way down. And then you can pop in your bearings. Make sure your bearings are being popped in against a dry surface. So I always end up cleaning all those surfaces so there's no assembly lube behind or machining lube behind the bearings. Then once you get ready to put in your billet main caps, the billet mains go in a certain direction. So you're going to want your bearing tangs on the same side. So, and with the billet main caps, they actually machine the ends. So the overall width of the cap varies depending on which area it's in. And that's so it presses in between the valley in the block. So it holds itself centered as well as square. And then they line bore and line hone those. So it's really critical that those go in a certain direction, as well as getting pressed in. You're going to want to tap them down evenly so they end up in there and they don't pull a burr off one of the sides. Usually there's a bevel on there that's pretty big, so you shouldn't end up with any issues, but make sure all those get pushed all the way down. Then on top of that, make sure you buy like a jug of the ARP fastener lubricant, and because you're going to need a lot of it. So you're going to want to put lubricant on the threads of the stud, lubricant on basically any surface that gets contacted, including both sides of the washer, the bottom side of the nut, the inside of the threads of the nut, all that stuff. The more lubricated surfaces you have, the better, more accurate torque you're going to get on the studs, as well as if you're getting any binding in the nut that's going on the stud, it's going to rotate the stud in the block, on the block end, and it's going to end up bottoming that stud out in the bottom of the block, which essentially distorts the block. The same thing happens with the cylinder heads. That's why you don't want to crank any of the cylinder head studs down too far. You actually end up distorting the block profile, which is why a lot of people machine the ends of the threads off the end of the studs. What we were checking right there was crank walk. So you end up putting a drop indicator gauge on the end of the crank, and you're just going to pry the crank back and forth against the thrust washers and make sure that you're getting around 4 thou of movement. You don't want too little, and you definitely don't want a bunch, but you just want to double check to make sure your thrust washers are good. After that, the ARP studs and those billet main caps get torqued 20, 40, 60. So those all get cranked down evenly all the way to eventually 60 foot-pounds. You may want to let the block sit for 24 hours and retorque them. You don't have to, but it was something that I usually end up doing. However, I know that those studs have already been torqued multiple times because they used them to hone and they use them to hone the billet mains at the machine shop. So I know they use those already. So they've already been pre-stretched and pre-torqued. So Right now we're just getting all the pistons ready to go. We're putting the wrist pins and the rods in the pistons. Those rods are bi-directional. You can put them in any direction. However, I always put them all in the same direction. So you're going to want to pop your clips in. Make sure you have somebody there to watch when you're popping your clips in, because they will fly out and you will lose them. So another thing we're doing right now is we're getting all the pistons ready to go in. So I'm soaking them all in royal purple break-in oil just to make sure that they're all soaked and ready to go. So we actually soak them in royal purple break-in oil and then let them sit for an hour. Then we went through on the cylinders. You're going to wipe out all your cylinders with automatic transmission fluid. The reason they use ATF to wipe out the cylinder walls is just because it has a lot of detergents in it and ends up pulling a lot of dirt and debris out of the pores of the steel and any metal really. So we use that to clean out the cylinders. You're going to want to do another final wiping before you actually press the pistons in. One of the things that kind of sucks about the using the ARP hardware on those rods is you can't really use a rod saver. So we couldn't use the hoop that we normally use when you press in the pistons that saves the rod from contacting the crank. But it wasn't a huge deal. You just want to move the crank away from that cylinder as far as you can. So put it on the bottom of the stroke and then pop that piston in. That Wiseco piston sleeve, the tapered sleeve, worked so good. Do not use a shitty ring compressor that you get from friggin' Pep Boys. Buy the sleeve. It'll make a huge difference. I was able to pop all those pistons in just with my thumbs. Didn't have to use the piston hammer at all. And you're going to want to put your pistons down, do 2 at a time. Just get them all dialed in, and you're going to want to pre-torque those. So those end up going 25, 45, 65 on the rods. Then we did some work on the block actually before we got it. So this is just what it looked like when we first got it back from machining. I just taped it up and threw some paper towel rolls inside the freeze plug holes. And then we ended up going through and spray painting the block. So we painted it black. I kind of wanted to go with silver just so it would match the cylinder head, because the cylinder heads are aluminum obviously, but we decided to just go with black just because the block was originally black and it is a cast iron block. So we went through, got all that stuff done. And here's a couple more photos of some other components that are on the block, as well as the billet mains and everything after we get everything installed. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you guys got some information out of this video, and that's pretty much all you need to do to build a nice rotating assembly bottom end for your 2JZ. And there's some photos coming up at the end also where I threw on the brand new rear sump oil pan, as well as the Titan oil pump and all that other stuff. So pretty cool. Hope you guys enjoyed.